Imagine this, you're waiting for a meal that could change your day, but instead, you're met with a confrontation that leaves you stunned. That's exactly what happened to me when an HOA Karen decided to block my Meals on Wheels delivery, and it gets even crazier. The driver wasn't just any delivery person, he was an off-duty cop. What started as a simple delivery turned into a confrontation that escalated quickly. It all started on a quiet morning when my Meals on Wheels driver pulled up, ready to hand over my meal. But right as he approached my door, a woman from the HOA, who I'd never seen before, stepped out of her house and stopped him. She insisted that he couldn't deliver food to me because I didn't have the right permits or some ridiculous HOA rule. But here's where it takes a turn. The driver wasn't some ordinary guy. He was an off-duty cop who didn't take kindly to being bossed around like that. The tension was palpable, and you could tell things weren't going to end quietly. Was this going to turn into a battle of power? How far would this HOA Karen go? The story's just getting started. Stay tuned to find out how this intense standoff played out. At first, I thought it was just some misunderstanding. Maybe she was having a bad day, or maybe she didn't recognize the Meals on Wheels driver. But the more she argued, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about food. She was determined to make an issue out of something that didn't need to be an issue. She started pointing at the delivery truck, complaining about how the parking lot was private property and how delivery drivers never followed the HOA guidelines. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't about rules. It felt like she was just looking for a reason to cause trouble. The driver, calm but firm, tried to explain the situation. He was just there to deliver a meal, something I rely on, and that's when I noticed the officer's badge clipped to his belt. It hit me. This wasn't a normal delivery. This guy was trained for confrontations, but even he seemed caught off guard by how persistent she was. The woman, however, wasn't backing down. She continued to argue, telling him he had no right to park there, even though the parking lot was shared by everyone in the neighborhood. What really stunned me was when she said, "You should be enforcing the rules, not breaking them." I could feel the tension rising. What would happen next? Would the situation escalate even further? You won't believe what she did next. Stay with me. This story is far from over. At this point, I could see that the whole situation was spiraling out of control. The HOA Karen was no longer just complaining about parking. She was outright confronting the driver, questioning his authority, and telling him that nobody gets special treatment. I'm standing there, frozen, just trying to make sense of it all. Why was this happening? The more she ranted, the more it felt like she wasn't just angry at the driver, but at me too, as if my reliance on Meals on Wheels was something to be ashamed of. The driver, though, didn't budge. He took a deep breath, probably recognizing the gravity of the situation, and calmly said, "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. I'm here to help people, not start a fight." But that only seemed to set her off more. She began accusing him of being unprofessional, telling him he had no right to park on her property, even though it was a shared space. Her voice got louder, and other neighbors were starting to gather around, probably curious to see what was going on. And then, out of nowhere, she pulled out her phone and started recording. "I'm documenting this for the HOA board," she declared, making it clear that she intended to escalate the situation. At this point, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Everyone was on edge, and I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she try to take this to the next level? What was her endgame here? I started to feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer just a food delivery. It was a battle of wills, and I could see it wasn't going to be over anytime soon. Would the officer step in and defuse the situation, or would this escalate even further? The question was hanging in the air, unanswered, and I could feel my heart racing as the standoff continued. The tension in the air was unbearable. The driver stood firm, trying to keep his cool, but it was obvious the situation was getting out of hand. The Karen was still recording, making sure to capture every word he said, every step he took. It felt like she was building her case, trying to find anything she could use to get him in trouble. And the more she filmed, the more people in the neighborhood started to gather, drawn in by the noise and the drama unfolding right before their eyes. I could feel my heart pounding, the silence between the confrontations almost as loud as the voices that had already been raised. The air was thick with unspoken threats. The driver was trying to reason with her, his voice calm and controlled, but she wasn't having any of it. She kept repeating how irresponsible and disrespectful the driver was for parking there, and I could see her eyes flickering to the other neighbors, almost like she was hoping they'd side with her. But then something strange happened. Another voice, an unexpected one, cut through the tension. A man I recognized from down the street, someone who had lived here for years, stepped forward and spoke up. "What's the real problem here, lady?" he asked. "It's just a delivery. Let the guy do his job." His words felt like a small lifeline, a sign that not everyone was going to stand by while this woman tried to make an issue out of nothing. But the Karen wasn't backing down. She turned on him, her tone venomous. "You don't get it. This is a rule breaker. It's about maintaining order." And then she snapped, "I'm calling the police." The moment she said that, everything seemed to freeze. The driver glanced at her, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Was this really going to turn into a police matter? Could it escalate even further? The question hung in the air, unresolved, as everyone braced for what might happen next. Would the cops show up? What would they think about this whole mess? The suspense was almost unbearable, and I had no idea how this would end. But I could feel the storm brewing, and it was clear we were all on the edge of something big. Just as the words "I'm calling the police" hung in the air, something unexpected happened. The driver, who had been so composed up until now, suddenly stepped back, his hand sliding to his phone. At first, I thought he was going to call for backup, but instead, he quickly tapped out a message and looked up at the woman. It was a strange moment, a beat of silence that stretched out longer than it should have. And then he did something I never saw coming. He pulled out a badge, a real, shiny police badge, and showed it to her. But here's the twist. It wasn't just any badge. It was a local police officer's badge, but it was part of an entirely different department than the one most of us were familiar with. The shock on her face was instant. The woman's smug expression dropped, and she faltered for a moment. "Wait, you're an actual officer," she stammered. The crowd around us began to murmur, clearly thrown by the sudden revelation. That's when the plot took another turn, something I hadn't anticipated at all. The officer, still calm, turned to the small crowd now gathered and spoke, his voice cutting through the confusion. "I'm a sworn officer, and I don't take kindly to anyone wasting my time with petty disputes like this one. If you have an issue with my parking or my delivery, take it up with the department." The crowd went silent. It was clear. He wasn't just some off-duty guy anymore. He was a man with authority. The Karen, flustered and now visibly shaken, tried to backpedal. "I didn't know you were a cop. I mean, I thought you were just a delivery driver." Her voice wavered, but she quickly recovered, trying to stand tall again, like she had some upper hand. "You still shouldn't be here. This is private property." It was like the ground shifted beneath our feet. Was she really trying to argue against a police officer's authority? The tension thickened again, and I could see the other neighbors looking at her with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The stakes had just been raised. What was going to happen next? Would she finally back off, or would she keep pushing this absurd fight? Everyone was waiting for the next move, and honestly, so was I. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The crowd stood frozen, watching the exchange between the HOA Karen and the off-duty cop, who was still holding his badge, clearly unbothered by her feeble attempts to challenge him. The Karen seemed to lose her bravado, stumbling over her words as she tried to regain control of the situation. But there was no way out for her now. The officer's presence had completely shifted the dynamic. "You're really going to argue with an off-duty cop about parking? Seriously?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a warning. She glanced around, realizing that most of the neighbors had shifted their support, their eyes now on her. The tables had turned. She was no longer the one in control. Still, she tried one last time to save face, claiming that rules were rules, but it was clear that her efforts had failed. The officer wasn't backing down, and neither was the crowd. Slowly, she realized she was fighting a losing battle. Just as the officer started to move toward his car to finish the delivery, there was a sudden shift, a surprising turn in the story. The neighbor who had stepped in earlier, the one who had supported the driver, suddenly raised his hand, catching everyone's attention. "Actually," he began, looking straight at the officer, "there's something you should know about this parking situation." We all turned toward him confused. His eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation before he spoke again, revealing the twist. "You see, this private property claim the Karen's been throwing around, it's not true. This parking lot isn't privately owned at all. It's actually public, part of the original neighborhood plan. The HOA doesn't have the authority to enforce those rules." The revelation hit like a bombshell. The Karen's eyes widened in shock as the truth sank in. All her claims about private property were completely invalid. The crowd exchanged glances, and for the first time, it seemed like the entire situation might actually end in a peaceful resolution. The officer looked at the Karen one last time, his tone now more firm than ever. "I'm not here to argue with you. But if you want to keep pushing this, we can get the real authorities involved. And trust me, you won't like how this ends for you." The Karen, completely deflated, finally gave in. She muttered something under her breath and walked away, defeated. The officer, now back to his calm demeanor, turned to the Meals on Wheels driver. "You're good to go. Sorry you had to deal with that." Just when I thought it was over, the final twist came. As the officer turned to leave, he glanced at me and smiled, revealing something that caught me completely off guard. "By the way," he said, "I'm not just an off-duty cop. I actually used to be the HOA president here, and trust me, the rules around here have never been as strict as she made them seem." His wink caught me off guard, and for a moment, I was speechless. I couldn't believe it. This entire scene had been about a power struggle over something as simple as a food delivery. But the way everything had unfolded, with the unexpected twist of the neighbor's revelation and the officer's true identity, left me stunned. In the end, justice had prevailed, but in a way I never saw coming. And as for the Karen, well, I think she learned the hard way that not everything she said could be taken at face value. As the officer walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The entire ordeal, which had started with a simple food delivery, had escalated into something no one could have predicted. The Karen, now defeated, disappeared back into her house, probably reconsidering how she'd spent the last hour of her life. The neighborhood, which had been drawn into the chaos, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as well. I turned to thank the Meals on Wheels driver, who gave me a small nod and finally delivered my meal. It was clear he was used to handling confrontations, but even he seemed glad it was over. The neighbor who had stepped in earlier gave me a reassuring smile, as if to say, "It's not always like this around here." As the crowd dispersed, I couldn't help but reflect on the whole situation. Sometimes, it's the small things, like a delivery that's supposed to help someone, that can bring out the worst in people. But in the end, justice had been served, and the real lesson was clear. Rules are only as powerful as the people who enforce them, and not every battle is worth fighting. With everything finally settled, I sat down to my meal, grateful for the kindness of strangers and the surprising twists life can throw your way.